Welcome to the Tough Decisions Network for Entrepreneurs. I'm Dan Handford, and my wife, Dennae, and I interview successful people sharing stories behind tough decisions that they've had to make along their journey as an entrepreneur. Before we get started, let's hear from one of our sponsors. Have you ever thought about investing in real estate, but find yourself so busy that you don't have time for it? Do you have FOMO, which is the fear of missing out? At HandfordCapital.com, we help investors with passive real estate investments that project better returns than traditional investment vehicles such as the stock market. If you'd like to find out more about our passive real estate investments, visit HandfordCapital.com. That's HANDFORD Capital.com. We will jump on a call with you to discuss your investment goals and to see if our investments are a good fit for you. This advertisement is not to be construed as an offer or recommendation to buy or sell a security. Visit HandfordCapital.com.
Welcome to this very special Friday edition. It's a very special edition because we're kicking off the new year. I know we did a couple episodes already on Friday, but they're kind of more geared towards goal setting and various things like that. This is kind of the first one we're going to be diving into some really good, deep content.
Yeah, so I thought it would be a good idea for us to talk about storytelling today. And I know the only reason I guess I really know too much about it is because I've heard you talk about it, and I know that it's something that we've worked on together for the brands that we have, been in the middle of for the last several years. But I thought it would be neat to just talk about storytelling. I know there's a lot of books out there, so if you're listening and you're not exactly sure about storytelling or how to develop a story for your brand, there's lots to read. But this episode, I thought we could just, kind of introduce our audience to storytelling maybe, or if you are aware, then we'll discuss it. Maybe you have some comments or questions or even some additional information that you could add on our Facebook page or website. That would be cool as well. But some things to talk about as far as storytelling. And I guess maybe you should go ahead and tell our audience exactly what storytelling is. Because it's not, reading a book, telling a story, a bedtime story, that kind of thing. That's not what we're talking about. So what's storytelling when it's related to your branding?
Sure. So, I think that the biggest thing that you have to understand about storytelling is that it allows you to be able to connect with your potential customer, your potential client or patient. Because when people see somebody in a business, a lot of times we just kind of have this inherent, thought that they're not real. But these people are all real people, and the way you can connect with your customers a little bit more is the ability to be able to tell them your story, tell them, why you are where you are. And I think one of the biggest issues with storytelling is that we're afraid. We're afraid to open up. We're afraid to share our story because we seem to think that it's going to put you in a vulnerable position.
Well, it kind of reminds me a little bit, now that I'm thinking about it, we've talked to a lot of entrepreneurs over the last 6 to 7 months, and when you tell your story, you don't pigeonhole yourself, but you identify yourself as something specific. And there may be people who don't like that, or that doesn't work for them. And what we've learned over the last 7 months with talking with these entrepreneurs and business owners is that that's okay. And so many times once you do that, the people that do want that and are looking for that, that's when they come flooding towards you, when you are not afraid to identify yourself. I think it's also important to realize that your story is about your brand, but it's not about your brand. So it is the most important information about your company or your product or you, but it's about relating that information to the customer's needs. And that's the whole point of the story, is you're kind of helping the customer by organizing all those most important details and relating it to the customer so that they know what you can do for them.
Well, I think that at the same time, we don't really sometimes know what is going to connect with our customers within our story. And there are going to be people that hear your story that will not want to do business with you, and that's okay too. But I think the ultimate result is going to be more people wanting to do business with you, because nobody is going to connect with every single piece of your story. It's just not going to happen. Unless they walk the same life as you, it's just not going to happen. But it's when they hear your story and they find something within your story where they can latch onto and they can go, yes, he or she is like me. Because we only do business with people like that you know, like, and trust. I talk about that even with my multifamily investing business when I'm talking to people who are getting into this space and trying to do what's called multifamily syndication. They talk about how to get investors. Well, the best way to get investors is to tell your story, because the more you can tell your story, the better and the closer you're going to become to being able to, for them to be able to know, like, and trust you. And nobody, whether it's $50,000 or $5, is going to really open up their wallet to you unless they know, like, and trust you.
And don't you also think that they may know, like, and trust you, but they may not have a need for what you are offering right now. But if you tell your story and they can connect to that, then 6 months, a year, 2 years, whenever it is, and they need that, then they're going to remember you because you told your story, and that's what they're remembering.
Well, I think that's the difference between brand building and just general marketing. Because we get into this habit as even as small business owners of saying, oh, we need to build our brand, we need to build our brand. But at the same time, you need to be marketing too. And marketing is really the act of promoting your brand and trying to get people to actually interact with and do what I like to call direct sales or direct a call to action, where you have a direct response. You put out an ad, you get a response right away. But in this situation, it is more of a long tail, long-term approach in a lot of cases, because you might talk to a room full of 100 people, a couple hundred people, 20 people, and only a quarter of the room really needs you right now. But you've planted a seed in the back of their head for future needs, and not just their future needs, but anybody else they come in contact with, they will also want to be able to think about you because you told your story and they connected with you.
And you're doing both all the time, right? I mean, you don't want to have an ad that doesn't call for a direct response, but you can also, in that same ad, be building your brand by telling your story and relating it to the customer. So all of that really should happen all the time.
That's correct. And the thing is that your standard marketing should do storytelling at the same time. It shouldn't just be a blanket, coupon or something like that. Now, obviously, different businesses are a different way, but when you start to tell your story, that really is where you connect. And, again, like let's go back to what I said earlier about, people feeling vulnerable when they start to talk about their story, right? Well, I think that it's a headspace issue. And you've got to get over that. You'd be surprised if you just actually tell your story, how many people will reach out to you and connect with you and say, thank you for sharing that. Because I had the same situation or a similar, thing happen in my life, and they connect with you. And when people connect with you, they're stuck with you.
And then when you relate your product or your service to their problems, that's really what they want to know. And they want to know about you, and then they want to know what you can do for them. They don't care about, all of the special tools that you use and how, the technicality of what you do. They want to know how you can help them. And I think, the biggest way that I learned this was through our medical clinics here that we have. We use a lot of special types of treatments, special equipment, special solutions, things like that, special the combinations of things that we did. But when you were advertising that, you never really went into detail about all those things. You always focused on the patient and what having that treatment would get them, and that made it very successful.
Well, and I know your background with a degree in English.
Right.
You're an English major, correct?
Right.
So I want you to talk to us a little bit about structuring a story too, because sometimes we can just tell a story and it doesn't really connect with people. But to be able to tell a story and have, the highs and the lows in the story and, the different pieces of it, what would you say is kind of a couple of tips to kind of make sure that in your story, you make sure that you have people that will stay engaged, but will also connect with you?
Right. So it's funny because I talked a little bit about this on a recent podcast. We're talking through the book Talk Like TED on Sundays, and one of the secrets of the world's top minds is their storytelling. People use storytelling to reach people, and the research is very, very compelling about using a story to actually get the customer or the listener, if you will, on the same brain wavelength. To me, that's just fascinating. So I can give you a ton of information and you can understand it and you can nod your head in assent and we can move on. If I use a story to give you that information, the neuro research actually shows that the listener and the speaker, their brains begin to sync up. And so therefore, it makes the information much more memorable and much more useful to the person listening just by using the story. There's also research about what kinds of stories really connect with people. And there's different ways of looking at it, but there's always one hero or one person, if you will. It could be a product, it could be a brand, and I'm going to come back to that in just a second, that people want to see succeed, but here's the catch. They also want to see the struggle, right? They want to see that person go through something difficult, something tragic, and then they want to see that person, I'm using person just as a general placeholder there, it could be anything. They want to see that hero come out of that difficult situation. And so there's lots of ways to structure that. You can start in a bad place and go up from there. You can start in a high point and show the struggle or the tragedy and then the hero coming back out of that. But we always want a hero. That's our just natural human tendency, is to see the hero.
And the important piece here about the hero is that your brand is not the hero.
And that's a lot of times because we are so, again, naturally egotistical, if you will. We tend to focus on ourselves. But the brand cannot be the hero. Who should be the hero?
The customer should be.
Right, the customer, yeah. The person that you're getting. And your brand or your service or your product is the facilitator, if you will, for that hero. So you want to make it about the customer, you want to make it about the person that you're trying to reach, and your brand or your service or your product is just what comes alongside and supports the hero of the story.
So I'm just kind of thinking through this a little bit here and just thinking about, going back to being vulnerable and telling your story, because we've always been told, not to share your religious views and not to share your political views and, obviously not to share your story to a point, because then people might know who you are.
We're basically told to be neutral on everything.
Yes. So, I guess you could say politically correct, if you will, in various areas. And even with me and my background in chiropractic, when we were trained in chiropractic college, we were told, don't ever talk to patients about religion, don't talk about politics, sports, any of that kind of stuff, because that's when you create, contention. And I would disagree with all of that, because I think that the more you share that information, the more people will connect with you. And yes, there's going to be people that won't want to do business with you, but there are people that probably you didn't want to be doing business with you anyway because you had nothing in common.
Right.
And so the more you tell your story, the people who didn't do business with you because you didn't tell your story are the people that you need to be connecting with.
Right. That's what you're missing out on by not telling your story. And the satisfaction and the fulfillment of helping people who like you and people who want your services and want your product. I mean, that right there is, what business is about, is finding those people that need you and want you and then helping them. So I think what we're missing by not telling our story is a lot greater than the vulnerability that, you mentioned we are kind of afraid of in telling our story.
And so let's kind of do a couple of different scenarios of where in business, to be able to build your brand or do your marketing, would you actually do it? Would you actually tell your story? Because you look at things and you're like, well, should I do this when I'm in front of people? Should I do it in writing? Should I do it like over a podcast like this? Or should I share my story? And the answer is yes.
Everywhere, right?
Yes.
Every opportunity you have.
And you'd be surprised at how many people will connect with you. But the biggest thing, though, is when you do it, no matter what it is, you must have a call to action at the end. Like, you can't just tell your story and that's it. You've got to have some sort of call to action, whether it be, a transition from your story into selling your product, because the story is your background and why you are where you are, and then it should relate to your brand, which would help build your brand up, and then have a call to action to be able to, for them to be able to take action.
Capitalize on that at the end by that call to action. And you can tell your story personally, you can tell your story in pictures. You don't even have to have words really to tell the story. You can use pictures to do that. You can use direct advertisement, as we talked about before. You can have, and I think this may be one of the more effective ways, is to have your staff and your employees constantly be telling your story. Every opportunity that they get to see that story. And you may not get to tell the whole story to every customer all the time, but you can see that all the time. And if you've trained your staff to do that, then that becomes your brand.
Well, and another level of storytelling by building your brand is also telling your customer's story. So when you have customers that come in, customers, patients, investors, and they have success in your business, tell their story, because their story will also help to build your brand.
Yeah, in telling their story, you are also telling your story.
And that's a little bit different than obviously telling your own personal story.
Right.
But that's a different level of storytelling. Is we're talking primarily about telling your background, your story, you're getting vulnerable and getting to the point where you're talking about something where emotions start to come up within you.
Right.
And get that teary-eyed, if you will. But it's also about helping your customers. And at the end of the day, if you can tell your customer story, that will just continue to enhance your brand. And then you can tell your story and the customer story side by side.
And, again, I see parallels here to the public speaking principles that we've been talking about, because every successful public speaker is going to capitalize on some kind of emotion. It's just going to happen because the brain processes things differently when there's some emotion involved there. So if you can get your customer or your client to tell their story, and you get to tell yours as well, and you can introduce some sort of emotional element, then it's going to be more memorable. That's just how our brains work. So finding those stories that do pull in some kind of emotion. And again, we've talked before, we're not talking about manipulating people in a bad way. You're just trying to make your product and your service memorable, and the way to do that is by telling an emotional story and not being afraid, like you said, to be vulnerable.
And when you start to have your customers tell their story, you should coach them. You should coach them along the way about what you're wanting them to talk about, because you want them to talk about things that people will connect with.
So here's a question. If you're starting a company and you're trying to figure out what your story needs to be or what you want your story to be, where do you start?
Well, I think it starts from the person who started the company. It starts with them telling their personal story about why they started their company to begin with and relating that back to the brand. I think it has to start with that person at the top. And then as you move forward in the business, it can start to move into more of your staff and your employees. And that's really the third level of storytelling is, well, number one is telling your personal story, the person who owns the business, who started the business, and why you got it started, why you're doing it. And then the second level is your customers, telling your customer story. But then your employees, having your employees tell their story. Because your employees should be connected with you they should be working with you because they believe in you and they believe in the brand, and they have a story behind their life about how they got to where you are as well. And if your employees haven't experienced your brand, if you will, no matter what it is, you need to get them to experience it so they can start to connect with it a little bit more, and then they start to be on board a little bit more, and they'll stay longer as well.
All right, so I think that wraps up our discussion of some storytelling today and its relation.
I guess you didn't like that
brand.
answer, did you?
No, I thought it was a good answer, but I don't think
we're going to stop it here.
No, it was fun, and I think the key is understanding why you're doing what you're doing. And if you don't have a reason for that, then you really don't have a place to start with a story. So that would be something to get clear on. But then once you are clear on that, the story sort of just flows out of that.
As a final thought, I think that as you start to grow your business and as you start to build up your brand, you should tell your story in as many places as possible. But one of the final thoughts that I'll leave you with is tell your story on your website. I was reading something recently. I'm part of this mastermind, and it's some really high-level people in there. And we were talking about webinars, and they were talking about how to increase registrations to an online webinar, right? And so I guess you would have an offline webinar,
right?
But to have a webinar, and the one that they tested all kinds of different variations, and one of the variations that increased the number of registrations was having a video on the webinar registration page that told the story of the person who was going to be presenting on the webinar. And so on your website, whether you're trying to get people to, sign up for an email list or, pick up the phone and call you to do some plumbing services or whatever, the more they can connect with you and the more they can relate with you, the more they're going to be able to want to do business with you. So thank you guys so much for listening in to this episode of the Tough Decisions for Entrepreneurs podcast. This is our Friday episode where we go through various things that we have done in our own businesses to grow our level of success that we have had right now. And if you have any ideas or any information or comments that you'd like to share with us, please do that. Go to toughdecisions.net. There's a place there to contact us. And also subscribe to our podcast, leave us a review, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Tough Decisions Network. Be sure to visit toughdecisions.net to gain access to show notes for this episode and to join our free weekly entrepreneur email where we will send you news about the latest technology for your business, inspiring quotes, and the latest books for entrepreneurs. That's toughdecisions.net.